slides, I think. Fantastic. So I'm going to talk through some published polls from the likes of YouGov, Mori, Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner, those kinds of agencies, and also some insights from the focus groups and depth interviews and those kinds of things that we've been running at Britain Thinks. The first thing to say is that the race as a whole is very close and very volatile. So about the poll of polls is saying that about 40% of the general public are planning to vote Remain, about 37% are planning to vote Leave, and a further 23% don't know. And those numbers have been sort of switching around a little bit, and there seems to have been some differences between online polling and telephone polling, but in the last week or so, they seem to have settled down to this kind of set of numbers. So it's really on a knife edge, and it's quite interesting because there's no real huge difference by lots of the really big demographics. So men and women are both within a few points of one another, with women slightly more likely, as in many polls, to say they're not sure at this stage, because often women make decisions a little bit later on. C1, C2, that kind of middle-class swing voter territory, almost tied on Leave and Remain. And the recent conclusion of the deal from David Cameron and the special cabinet and the beginning of the campaign hasn't really led to much of an increase so far in people making their minds up. And what, in fact, you've seen is a slight uptick in the proportion of people who say they don't know. So who is saying that they're going to vote Leave? Older people by about 60 to 30. Less well-off people, so people in social grade C2, DE, by about 50 to 33, with the remainder don't know. UKIP voters, 91% of UKIP voters are going to vote out. Conservative voters at around 45 to 30, but with about a quarter still undecided. People in the Midlands are particularly outish, and Telegraph readers. Who's voting Remain? Young people by about 55 to 20, but they're also much less likely to say they'll definitely vote. So 50% of 18 to 30-year-olds say they'll definitely vote, whereas it's about 70% of over 65s. Wealthier people, so people in social class A, B, by about 50 to 30 voting in favour of remaining. Labour voters, Scotland and the south of England, and Guardian readers. Interestingly, the single best predictor is education level. If you have a degree, you're about 70-30 likely to be voting Remain. If you left school at 16, you're about 65-35 the other way. And that has really big implications for how you think about things like that age difference, because actually those older cohorts, people aged 65 and over, only about 10% of those populations went to university. So you may be looking at a very different point of view as cohorts move through the electorate. This graph shows how solid those votes are. And what you see is that the balance continues. So there's about 25% on either side of the vote who are saying there's just no chance they're going to change their mind. There's a further 10% who say there's some chance they're kind of persuadable. I think they're probably not. My experience of doing qualitative work with people during the 2015 election campaign was that people who said there was some chance that they might change actually spent the campaign collecting evidence for the way that they were already leaning and ignoring everything that might contradict their pre-existing lean. So in the middle there is about 30% of people who are kind of genuinely persuadable, 6 or 7% on either side with a bit of a lean, and about 16% who are saying that they're genuinely undecided at this stage. There is a bit of a difference at that kind of wide level. Anyone who says there's a chance they'll change, Conservatives are just more likely to say there's a chance they'll change their minds. And this poll was taken just after David Cameron came back from his negotiations. Another really important thing is that those swing voters, these people who are less certain, are also less certain that they're going to vote. So only 40% of them are saying they're 10 out of 10 going to vote. So what's going to make up the minds of those people who are undecided at this stage? This is a difficult concept to grasp, but immigration, which seems to be the sort of main kind of ballpark in which the campaign is being played out, is actually kind of table stakes. For most people, regardless of whether you're in favour or against staying in the EU, the view is that being in the EU is not great from perspective of immigration and control of our borders. So if you do a kind of regression or a key driver analysis on what drives people's intended vote, what you find is that immigration is largely irrelevant. Almost everyone thinks the EU is not great from an immigration perspective. And the question is how far they're prepared to consider other issues in the way that they weigh up this question. So what does seem to make a difference? The key driver of the leave vote is the belief that leaving the EU would provide more control, particularly over the economy. It's an argument that stems from kind of common sense, this idea that, well, if they're making some decisions, then we're not in control. It's not based in any kind of depth of economic argument. It's much more about just an idea of sovereignty or an idea that there are others making decisions for us. The key driver of thinking that we should remain is the belief that the economic risk of leaving outweighs any other advantages that might be gained. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there should be an out-and-out risk message from the Remain camp, but one has to guess that they've been testing that leap in the dark line quite a lot, and it's probably quite effective. Underpinning these two points of view is a really important thing that comes out in the qualitative research, which is the extent to which people feel that the EU has benefits and impacts on their lives, in particular around employment and trade. In focus groups, when you ask people what the downsides of the EU are, people have very clear concerns that are tangible, they're values-led, and they're clearly linked to their experience of everyday life. Uncontrolled immigration, which they perceive to have direct impacts on their life through congestion in services, through changes to the lived environment and through competition for jobs, a sense of laws and regulations that are at best undemocratic and at worst a burden of red tape. Think about straight bananas, think about prisoners being given rights to watch television, those kinds of stories, very top of mind for people. The sense that it's bureaucratic and that it's a waste of money, and people find that the figures involved very, very difficult to deal with in their heads. On the other side, the benefits in favour of remaining in the EU are quite vague, they're quite technocratic, and they're very collective rather than being personal. So if you ask in a focus group, what do you think are the main benefits of the EU? People, first of all, they'll talk about how easy it is to go across borders and the fact that they don't need to change their money and they've got some euros in their sock drawer for next year. Then the second thing they'll say is it something to do with trade? And you say, well, what do you mean? And they'll say something like, well, if we all band together, we can probably get a better deal from the rest of the world. So the first thing is the fundamental idea of why the EU might be of benefit isn't in people's heads. The idea of a single market isn't their conception of what trade means. And even if they do understand the idea of the single market, there's another even deeper issue, which is this view that their understanding of trade is limited to trade of goods. So they'll say, we don't make anything anymore in the UK. And so the idea of a trade in service just isn't there for most. There's a real challenge for the Remain camp to land those economic benefits in a really tangible way. And that's about jobs, and it's about showing what trade really means to the UK. In terms of who people trust to tell them about this, the poll, the main box there is how far swing voters trust different politicians, with Boris Johnson getting a slightly more trusted than David Cameron, Jeremy Corbyn having very clearly net distrust and all the rest similarly. The line on the bottom is from a Mori poll asking people who would be most important for helping them make up their mind. And that's where you see that David Cameron actually increases and becomes even more important amongst Conservative voters. And Greenberg, Quinn and Rosner have done some research which goes beyond politicians, and what they find is this huge level of trust in people like Martin Lewis, a real desire to hear from people like James Dyson because he represents something tangible and tangible manufacturing. And then really, Sir Stuart Rose not doing it for people. Similarly, Tony Blair, not a great spokesperson. Lastly, in my last minute, I just want to talk about what, if anything, financial services can do to have a voice in this debate. I'm not sure whether there's a settled view of the financial services industry on this, but at the moment, it's deeply distrusted by members of the public, and it's also associated with one element of financial services, which is the banks, in inverted commas. There's a real need for financial services to find its voice. At the moment, its only association is with the banks. There's a need to talk from the basics upwards, talk about employment, to show the value of the EU or the value of leaving for the sector and link it to impact on the ground in people's lives, and not just in the City of London. And lastly, there's something about if you're going to speak up on this issue, you need to show that it's good for business. If you pretend it's an altruistic, good for the country argument, people are going to dismiss it because they don't believe you. Whereas if you start from a position of this is win-win, it's right for us, it's right for this very important sector, then maybe there's an opportunity for financial services to add their voice.
Ben. Well, thanks for really sort of setting the scene there. And I think that sort of polling data is really fascinating, particularly in light of what we learned about polling data from the general election. But we are now going to turn and get into the guts of the debate. So, Andrew, can I ask you to kick us off?
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And we thought we'd try and liven up the end of the session here before the drinks with a bit of a debate on the merits of the UK remaining in the EU. When I heard that Roger Bootle was going to come and speak at this session, I thought, well, I've got to come along and balance out the debate. And then when I heard that a pollster was coming, I also thought, well, pollsters weren't very good at predicting the results of the election. Actually, the economy was a better predictor of the election in 2015. So perhaps I should come and put the economic arguments. I want to cover 4 main points. First of all, to give an idea of the context, which tends to get a bit lost in the discussion. The UK's experience as a member, we joined something called the European Economic Community. It then became called the European Community, and then it became called the European Union. Our experience in that grouping as a member of Europe has actually been relatively positive, so it's important to get that across. Second point, what are the alternatives? And there's a lot of ambiguity about the alternatives. What are the economic consequences of leaving the EU, and then what are the conclusions? So let me run through those points in turn. I started studying economics in 1974, which was probably one of the worst years for the British economy that we've had since the Second World War. It was actually the year after, I think, 1975, when inflation hit somewhere like 27%. It was a very turbulent period. So we joined the EU and ran into a very turbulent period, which was not really anything to do with the EU, to be fair. It was due to the mismanagement of our own economy. But once we come through that, if you look at our experience since 1980, when the UK economy began to stabilise, the UK's GDP per head, which is a very good catch-all measure of how our economy is doing relative to other economies, has actually been the strongest in terms of growth among the G7 economies. So once we got through that period of turmoil, actually our experience has been pretty good relative to our peer group. And that includes in the G7, we also have France, Germany and Italy, other members of the European Union. Now that's clearly a product of a composite of factors, but it also reminds us that actually we've not done badly in the European Union. There isn't a case, I don't believe, for coming out of the European Union because our economy has performed badly rather than the reverse. Why have we had that relatively good performance? Well, the UK has benefited from being a business-friendly and flexible major EU economy with a relatively low share of public spending and taxation. I say relatively low because relative to other European countries, if you go to the US or countries outside the EU in Asia, they have quite low shares of public spending and taxation. Ours has been around about 40% of GDP, but you've got countries in the EU like France and Italy who have a spending ratio of over 50% of GDP, which is, I don't think, not very healthy for their economies. But my point here is that actually we hear a lot about regulation holding back our economy and the fact that we're over-regulated and things are very difficult for us from being in the EU. Our experience actually is that we have quite a lot of room for manoeuvre, and the regulation that we have doesn't seem to have held back our economy relative to our European partners. The UK economy is highly dependent on trade and investment, and that's a key point because the trading relationships we have with other European countries through the EU have underpinned the growth of our economy for over 40 years now. And we've also attracted a lot of foreign direct investment. The UK is the strongest attractor of foreign direct investment in the European Union. And that's supported jobs not just in London and the South East, but in the regions of the UK and Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales as well. It's true that business regulation has increased, but this was actually the price we have paid for an initiative that the UK supported in the 1980s, the Single European Market, which came into being in the early 1990s. And you know, there's a swings and roundabouts reality to life, that you have to accept sometimes things that you're not totally comfortable with because you get offsetting benefits. And so much of the business regulation that people complain about does actually come through our membership of the single market. And so there are offsetting benefits. And the final point I would like to make in terms of economic policy, the two big levers of economic policy, and I think Roger will hopefully agree with me on this, are fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy being government spending and taxation, and monetary policy being the setting of interest rates and quantitative easing and all that sort of stuff. And the reality is that our membership of the EU per se, if we were in the euro it would be different, but our membership of the EU per se gives us a fair, almost total autonomy on both those big levers of policy. There are some constraints on the tax side in terms of VAT, excise duties. We have to pay some net contributions into the EU, but that's pretty small beer in the total picture. So we've got control of our economy. We've done quite well. We do suffer probably from more regulation than we'd ideally like, but that's the price of being in the single market. That's the economic context. Now, what's the alternative? And one of the issues, I think, one of the concerns we have at PwC talking to our clients is it's not at all clear what the alternative is. There is a model of being in what's called the European Economic Area, which is the situation that Norway and Iceland are in, very small countries. They accept all the rules with no influence. Now, the UK is the second biggest economy in the EU behind Germany. It doesn't really make sense to put ourselves in that position. Switzerland has a very close partnership and accepts many of the aspects of being in the EU and has negotiated specific arrangements. Again, the Swiss economy is much smaller than the UK. It's not one of the top economies in the world. The two real alternatives are that we find a new set of free trade agreements, not just with the EU and with the other trade partners around the world, or that we trade with the EU and the rest of the world under WTO rules, which is basically we accept a sort of default arrangement in the world trading system. Both of those would probably result in much less advantageous trading agreements with our current European partners. So the prize that has to be offered on the other side is, well, somehow we can get better arrangements with other countries around the world. Well, I'll leave Roger to make that case if he thinks that's the situation. Why does this matter? Well, if we look at trade, and investment is very closely related to trade, they make up over a third of the spending that drives the GDP of the UK economy. Consumer spending is about a half, government spending is about 15%. So if we have some big disruption to our trading and investment relationships, that is a big deal for the UK economy. Our trade, our exports, which includes services as well as goods. In fact, services exports overtook manufactured exports for the first time in the UK in the second half of last year. These are very important drivers of the growth of the UK economy. So what would be the consequences of leaving the EU? Well, the work that we've done at PwC has highlighted 5 main issues, and there's probably not a great deal of controversy about these issues. There may be controversy about the balance of economic effects behind them. Trade and investment. I've argued that I think there would be quite a negative shock to the UK economy in terms of our existing trade relationships. Uncertainty associated with an economic shock to trade and investment. We're not clear what the alternatives are. Uncertainty is bad in the business world. It's bad in the financial world. Migration is a bit of a mixed bag. It depends on where you sit. I think from a point of view of business, constriction on migration would be seen as a negative thing. But in many sectors of the public, as Ben has highlighted, that is seen as a contentious issue. So I've put that down as a mixed. Though economically, my belief is that restricting migration to too great an extent would be negative for the UK economy. We could get some positives from more regulatory freedom. But we have to remember, and those of you who watch Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister will understand this, that a lot of regulation that comes from the EU has been gold-plated and added to by British civil servants. So not all the regulation that we have that is linked to the EU is wholly driven from Brussels and from the European institutions. That is potentially positive, but I think there's some question marks about what the sort of changes that we might realistically make on that front. And then there's the issue of our fiscal contributions, which come to net about 0.5% of GDP. Now, we have to put that in context that the government spends over 40% of GDP, so we're talking about roughly 1% of total spending. So, yes, we could save a bit of money not paying into the EU. That could be seen as a positive thing, but it could be a small benefit. So where do I come out on this debate? Well, I believe leaving the EU would disrupt our trade and investment relationships, which have underpinned the UK and its economic growth for 40 plus years. So I think there is potentially quite a big economic shock that could flow from that. That's something that Mark Carney talked about yesterday, and I would agree with him on that point. Looking back, it's not that our experience in the EU has been a bad time for us. It's generally been successful for the UK economy. We've had flexibility to exploit our competitive advantages, and we've had much better GDP per head growth than other leading economies. There would be a period of uncertainty, which is bad for business, following a Brexit, because the alternative is not clear. We can't assume a benign transition. There will be trade and investment disruption, business financial uncertainty. There will be some impact on migration. Those are the main potentially negative economic impacts. More regulatory freedom and lower fiscal contributions are potentially positive, but in my view likely to be smaller. So looking at it from my perspective, having been a business economist over the last 30 years in a variety of capacities, it looks to me like the net impact on the UK economy of leaving the EU would be negative, both in the short term and the longer term. Thanks very much.
And Roger, over to you to put the counter view.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this really very important topic at this fascinating time. I have to say, I feel sorry for the man and woman in the street, because it's very difficult, I think, to get a fair and balanced view on this question. You'll have noticed that so many people presenting on this, they're committed one way or the other, they're distinctly unbalanced, they're biased, and how on earth can you react to that? By contrast, what you'll hear from me is a middle-of-the-road, unbiased, uncommitted view that goes straight down the middle of this debate and nevertheless points quite clearly towards the exit of the EU, that is. Now, let me say, first of all, there are, of course, bigger issues at stake here than mere economics. Questions of democracy, sovereignty, security, peace. I think these are ultimately more important, actually, than the price of fish and such like, but I'm going to leave that to one side and just concentrate on the pure economics of the issue. I say pure, but actually, of course, they're pretty impure. We both actually, Andrew and I, write for the Tory graph from, to some extent, opposing points of view. I don't know about you, Andrew, but I get a lot of correspondence from my readers, and in particular, I love the ones that come from Disgusted from Tunbridge Wells. And I've had a few recently. One the other day particularly amused me. He said, what we need is the facts. We don't need all these opinions about the EU. We want the facts. And by the way, with the greatest respect, Mr. Bootle, your last few contributions on this have been completely and utterly useless. Well, the fact of the matter is, of course, there aren't facts, actually. There are assumptions, there are views, there are facts and factoids I suppose you can push or bend in a certain direction, but this is not something on which you're going to get the objective truth. Now, in particular, I've done an investigation of the various calculations and estimates there are of the net benefit and cost of Britain leaving the EU, and it's fascinating. There are people who believe that if Britain leaves the EU, that will reduce the level of our GDP in about 10 or 15 years' time by 12%. And there are others who argue that it will increase the GDP of the UK by about 12%, and there are all stations in between, which I suppose will serve to confirm all your worst views about economists. Now, the reason there is this fantastic range is not because the economists can't do their sums, it's because there are some genuine uncertainties at the heart of this issue. And I'll give you two. The first touches on what Andrew was mentioning before. That's to say the nature of the trade relationship that we would secure after we left the EU. At one extreme is the idea of the Norwegian option, under which we carry on pretty much as before, in which case the damage to trade will be very, very small, next to non-existent. And at the other extreme, there's the idea that we would get no trade deal with the EU at all. They would apply the common external tariff. We wouldn't get good trade deals outside the EU, and the EU might even cut up rough. Even though it was against the rules, they might discriminate against us. And all stations in between. So that's one set of uncertainties. The second concerns regulation. Now, for those people who come up with very big estimates of the benefits of leaving the EU, it tends to be because they attribute a very high number to the cost of regulation. And in truth, it's very difficult to come up with anything remotely approaching an objective assessment of all this. But there's a more fundamental uncertainty. It's all very well saying, if we came out of the EU, we could rescind this whole raft of EU regulations, which we could. But the more important uncertainty is, would we? So those people who come up with a hard and fast view, or think it's possible to come up with a hard and fast view, in fact have to make an assumption about which regulations we would repeal and rescind outside the EU. Where's the hard and fast fact about all that? So the way I like to put this is that I don't think myself there'd be some regulatory or deregulatory nirvana the day after we came out of the EU. I think there's an opportunity for this country to pursue a path of deregulation over a number of years, an opportunity that I hope we would seize, and I suspect the benefits from that will be very substantial. But no one should assume that this is going to happen automatically on day one, or indeed that it's going to happen at all. I mean, a Corbyn-led government, for instance, perish the thought, presumably would have a different policy with regard to deregulation from a normal Conservative government. Financial services, how do they stack up in this debate? Well, first of all, let's get some perspective. How big are they and how important are they? And the answer is, of course, they are very big and very important, but I suspect not quite so big and so important as many people, not least those in the financial services industry, imagine. The sector accounts probably for about 8% of GDP, and of that, around about a half, about 4%, probably represents what we might term wholesale financial services or the city. So it's big, although it's not overwhelming. Of course, the UK does run a significant surplus with the European Union, well, with all countries on financial services, but with the European Union it runs a significant surplus of about £16 billion a year, namely about 1% of GDP. And a lot of people think this could be at risk if we leave. At the moment, a lot of interest centres around so-called passporting rights. That's to say, the idea that in order to sell to the European Union financial services, you have to have a substantial operation in the European Union. And under this requirement, of course, lots of non-EU banks from Switzerland, the US and elsewhere set up their operations somewhere in the EU, and that's tended to be in London. And the suggestion is, if we pull out of the EU, these banks will have to relocate to Paris, Frankfurt, Dublin, Luxembourg, or wherever. Now, there's clearly something in this, particularly with regard to banks, where it's quite clear that the EU would insist on significant operations being transferred, with capital, buildings, people, all the rest of it. It's quite clear that would happen. It's not so clear with regard to all sorts of other financial services. But the question is, I think, getting this into perspective, is this all that's relevant to the world of financial services? Can we really imagine the American investment banks, or indeed the Swiss investment banks, transferring their operations wholesale to the continent? I can't. Has the industry suddenly forgotten about bonus caps? Not long ago, they were up in arms about the idea that bonus caps imposed by the EU would cause us in Britain, and indeed the EU, to lose large amounts of business to New York, Dubai, Singapore, and heaven knows wherever else. Britain opposed these bonus caps in the EU. We lost the battle, they're imposed. If we were outside the EU, we wouldn't need to impose them. What about the financial transactions tax? Presumably, the financial services industry is in love with that, would like it, would it? I think not. Currently, this proposal is stuck in the regulatory long grass somewhere in the EU. It might well re-emerge at some point or other. The general attitude to financial services, what is it on the continent, in the Commission, in the governments of the EU? Well, we all know what the attitude is. They don't like it. They're deeply suspicious of it, which is why we've got things like the FTT, the bonus caps, and all the rest of it. So I put it to you, if you're one of these overseas banks and Britain leaves the EU, are you actually going to want to transfer your operations wholesale to the continent? I bet you wouldn't, and face Monsieur Hollande's tax rates, or the rather chilly welcome you might find in Frankfurt, if you could find anything to do, or indeed any welcome there at all. What you would do is you would transfer the bare minimum to comply with European regulations. And then there's the question about the future. This is a very important decision that should be made not on the basis of the immediate short term, but the medium term and long term future. What is the position of the financial services industry going forward? Like so much else in Britain, we're going to depend upon our ability to sell to the rest of the world beyond Europe, in Asia and elsewhere. That is the critical thing. Are we going to be able to do that best as a member of the EU or outside? I think the answer is quite undoubtedly outside. Which connects with an overarching point. Andrew talked about our success within the EU, and we have done quite well within the EU, but not because of the EU, almost certainly despite the EU. Look at the EU's economic record. It's appalling. Look at the EU's economic record compared to just about any part of the developed world. It's done badly, and what's more, I think I know why. Because it makes bad decisions, and it makes bad decisions because it's badly structured, because its institutions don't work. What are those bad decisions? The cap, Schengen, the euro, every single one a winner. And then we've got the fact that with the euro, something's got to change. People say, if you leave, it's all going to be terribly uncertain, a leap in the dark, oh. If we stay, do we think that's going to be certain? We're going to face the fact that the euro is a disaster. It's a halfway house. It's got to go one way or the other. It's either got to break up or it's got to go forward to full fiscal and political union. If it does the latter, what is our position going to be in the EU? It's going to be perilous, despite whatever the Prime Minister thinks he has secured. The single market. Oh, the single market, the single... You hear this so often. No one understands it, in my experience. It's one of those phrases that gets trotted out all the time. You get the impression that the single market corresponds to a closed space, a sort of trading floor with a door. And at the door stands an official checking tickets, presumably Jean-Claude Juncker. Oh, can you come in? I'm not going to see your ticket. And if you aren't a member of this particular club, you can't come in. What complete nonsense! Could you please explain the export success of the United States, Canada, Australia, Korea, anywhere in the world that sells into the single market? You don't need to be a member of the single market in order to sell into it. Lastly, the vision. My problem with the EU, I think the whole vision of it is wrong. And it became wrong recently. The difficulty is you had an original 6 members that were fairly similar culturally in terms of GDP per head and all sorts of issues. And what they embarked on was essentially a course towards the United States of Europe. In 1988, then Mrs. Thatcher, Prime Minister, made a speech at Bruges, which I think is justly famous. She said, look, the EU has a choice between widening and deepening. You can't do both. Do one thing or the other. And in the end, the EU did both. And this is why we have got this incipient disaster. That's to say, the structures, the aims, the institutions are still working towards the formation of a United States of Europe, while actually you've expanded the borders to the east, you've taken in all sorts of people at a completely different level of GDP per head and sophistication and development. That's why you've got the migrant problem. And still this goes on. Serbia knocking at the door. Before very long, Turkey. Already the population of the EU is getting on for 3 times what it was when we first joined it. So essentially, my case against all this is that things have changed dramatically since we joined in 73 and also since we voted in 75. We've changed, the EU's changed, the world has changed. Now, John Maynard Keynes, one of my heroes, possibly one of Andrew's, once famously said, when he was criticised for changing his mind, he started off by saying, "Sir." For some reason, all the best quotes start with "Sir." Anyway, "Sir, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?" This is a question I think we should all ask ourselves and also ask those people who would be our leaders. Thank you very much.